Gideon Cross stood at the edge of his mother's grave with a gold ring burning in his palm, the last piece of her that hadn't turned to dust. 15 years of lonely mornings had taught him one truth: love was a lie women told to get what they wanted. His calloused fingers opened. The ring tumbled into the dirt. But before it could vanish, his brother's hand shot out and caught it mid-fall. "You throw this away," Luke said, his voice raw, "and you bury the only part of yourself worth saving." Gideon's jaw tightened. He didn't answer. He couldn't. Because Luke was right, and that terrified him more than being alone forever. If you're watching from anywhere in the world, drop a comment with your city so I can see how far this story travels. Hit that like button and settle in, because what happens next will change everything these two brothers thought they knew about trust, survival, and the kind of love that refuses to die quietly. The Colorado sun had no mercy. It hammered the dry earth until the ground cracked open like old leather, and the wind carried nothing but dust and the smell of sage burning under a sky too wide to forgive anything. Gideon Cross walked the fence line of the Double C Ranch with his hat pulled low and his shoulders set against the world. He didn't talk much. Didn't need to. The cattle knew his step. The horses turned their ears when he passed, and the few hired men who worked his land had learned long ago not to ask questions about the man who paid them fair, but never smiled. He was 34 years old and looked older. Deep lines bracketed his mouth. His hands were scarred from barbed wire, branding irons, and the kind of work that didn't stop for weather or grief. His eyes, gray as storm clouds, had stopped softening years ago. People in Miller's Crossing called him fair, called him honest, but they also called him cold. And Gideon didn't argue. Cold kept people at a distance. Distance kept him safe. 15 years ago, his mother died in the front room of the ranch house, her hand reaching for his father's, her voice a whisper about love and legacy and the importance of family. His father had followed her 6 months later, heart sick and hollow. Gideon inherited everything: 2,000 acres, a herd of prime cattle, a house too quiet for one man, and a younger brother who still believed the world could be kind. Luke Cross was 28 and stubborn as a mule in mud. Where Gideon had gone silent, Luke stayed loud. Where Gideon built walls, Luke tore them down. He laughed easy, flirted with the girls in town, and refused to let his brother disappear into bitterness. But even Luke had limits. And this morning, standing at their mother's grave with that gold ring glinting in Gideon's palm, he'd reached one. "You've been carrying that ring for 5 years, Luke said, his voice tight. "Ever since Martha walked out. And now you're going to throw it in the dirt like it means nothing?" Gideon's fingers closed around the ring again. The metal was warm from his skin. "It doesn't mean anything anymore. It was Ma's. Ma's dead." Luke flinched. "That doesn't make it worthless. Doesn't make it useful either." Gideon's voice was flat, emotionless. He'd learned to keep everything locked down, every flicker of hurt or hope sealed behind a wall of stone. "I'm done pretending there's something out there worth waiting for." "You mean someone?" Gideon didn't answer. He didn't have to. They both knew what he meant. Women had come and gone from Gideon's life like summer storms, brief, loud, and ultimately empty. There was Martha, who'd smiled sweet and left the moment she realized Gideon wouldn't sell his father's land to buy her a house in Denver. There was Caroline, who'd batted her eyes and whispered about partnership until Gideon caught her going through his financial ledgers. And before them, a string of others who saw the ranch, the cattle, the money, and never once saw him. So he stopped looking, stopped hoping. And the ring, his mother's wedding ring, the one she'd worn for 30 years through drought and plenty, sickness and health, had become a reminder of everything he'd never have. Luke stepped closer, his boots crunched on the dry grass. "You throw that ring away, you're throwing away the last piece of yourself that still believes." "Believes in what?" "In anything good." Gideon's jaw worked. He wanted to argue, wanted to tell Luke he was wrong, that belief was for fools and dreamers, that the world didn't reward hope. It punished it. But the words stuck in his throat. Because somewhere, buried deep beneath the scar tissue and the silence, a part of him still ached, still wanted, still wondered if maybe, just maybe, he was wrong. He opened his hand. The ring sat there, small and simple and unbearably heavy. Luke took it, slipped it into his pocket. I'm keeping this. And one day when you stop being an idiot, I'm giving it back. Gideon turned away. Don't hold your breath. But Luke just smiled, sad and stubborn and far too hopeful for a man who'd watched his brother turn to stone. I've got time. What? The stagecoach wreck happened 3 days later. Gideon heard about it from old Henry, who ran the livery in Miller's Crossing and had a talent for knowing everything before it happened. Stage flipped at the bend near Copper Ridge, Henry said, leaning against the fence while Gideon loaded feed sacks. Drivers busted up, passengers scattered. Doc Miller's out there now, but he's asking for help. Gideon paused. How many passengers? 4, maybe 5. One of them's a woman, bleeding bad, they say. Gideon didn't ask more questions. He swung into the saddle and rode hard toward Copper Ridge, the sun beating down and the wind kicking dust into his face. He didn't know why he went, didn't examine the impulse. He just moved, the way he always did when something needed doing. The wreck was worse than Henry described. The stage lay on its side, one wheel still spinning lazily in the air. Luggage and supplies scattered across the road. A young man sat against a rock holding his arm at an awkward angle. An older woman dabbed at a cut on her forehead with a handkerchief. And near the overturned coach, kneeling in the dirt with her sleeves rolled up and her hands slick with blood, was a woman Gideon had never seen before. She wasn't beautiful in the way men usually noticed. No delicate features or practiced smiles. Her hair, dark brown and tied back in a braid, was streaked with dust. Her dress was plain, practical, already torn at the hem. But her hands moved with precision, tying a tourniquet around the driver's leg while she murmured instructions to Doc Miller, who worked beside her with the grim focus of a man who'd seen too much death. Pressure here, she said, her voice clear and steady despite the chaos. Don't let up. If the bleeding doesn't slow in 2 minutes, we'll need to cauterize. Doc Miller nodded, sweat dripping from his brow. You've done this before. More times than I'd like. Gideon dismounted. His boots hit the ground and the woman's head snapped up. Her eyes met his, sharp, assessing, the color of strong whiskey in lamplight. She didn't smile, didn't soften, just looked at him the way a general might size up a soldier. You here to help or stare? She asked. Gideon blinked. Nobody talked to him like that. Not in Miller's Crossing, not anywhere. Help? Good. There's a medical trunk in the luggage, black leather, brass latches. Find it. He didn't argue. He moved to the scattered bags and cases, lifting, checking, discarding. The trunk was half buried under a crate of dry goods. He hauled it free and carried it to her. She didn't thank him, just flipped it open and pulled out clean bandages, a needle, thread, a bottle of something clear and sharp-smelling. Hold his leg steady, she told Gideon. He knelt. The driver, a wiry man in his 50s, groaned, his face pale and slick with sweat. Gideon gripped the man's calf, his hands firm but careful. The woman worked fast, her fingers deft as she cleaned the wound, stitched the torn flesh, wrapped it tight. She didn't flinch at the blood, didn't hesitate. And when the driver cried out, she spoke to him in a low, calm voice that somehow cut through the pain. Almost done. You're doing fine. Just a little longer. Doc Miller sat back on his heels, breathing hard. Where'd you learn to do that? The woman didn't look up. Field hospitals, army camps, places where you learn fast or people die. You a nurse? I'm a lot of things. She tied off the last stitch, checked the bandage, then finally sat back. Her shoulders sagged slightly, and for the first time Gideon saw the tremor in her hands. Saw the dark stain spreading across her left sleeve. Blood. Her blood. You're hurt, he said. She glanced down at her arm as if noticing it for the first time. It's nothing. You're bleeding through your sleeve. I said it's nothing. But when she tried to stand, her legs wobbled. Gideon caught her elbow, steadying her. She pulled away, but not before he felt the heat of her skin, the tension thrumming through her like a wire pulled too tight. Doc Miller stood, wiping his hands on a rag. Let me see that arm. After everyone else is stable. Miss, everyone else first. Her voice was iron. Doc Miller sighed, but didn't push. He turned to the other passengers, checking injuries, offering water. The woman stayed where she was, swaying slightly, her good hand pressed against her wounded arm. Gideon watched her, studied her, saw the way her jaw clenched against pain, saw the flicker of something in her eyes, not fear exactly, but something close, something guarded. "What's your name?" he asked. She hesitated. Clara Hale. Gideon Cross. "Rancher? How'd you know?" "Your hands, your boots, the way you carry yourself." She met his eyes again, and this time there was a ghost of a smile. "Plus, you smell like cattle and leather." He almost smiled back. Almost. "Where were you headed?" The guardedness returned, shuddering her expression. "Wherever the stage was going." "That's not an answer." "It's the only one you're getting." "Fair enough." Gideon didn't pry. He understood the need for privacy, for walls, for keeping your business to yourself. He respected it. But something about Clara Hale made him curious in a way he hadn't felt in years. Maybe it was the competence. Maybe it was the fear she tried so hard to hide. Or maybe it was the simple fact that she'd looked at him like he was useful, not dangerous. Like he was a person, not a problem. "You need work?" he heard himself ask. She stared at him. "What?" "You said you're a lot of things. That include veterinary work?" "I've treated animals, horses, cattle, dogs, some farm work." "I've got a ranch. Could use someone with medical skills. Animals get hurt. Men get careless. Pays fair." Clara's eyes narrowed. "Why would you offer that to a stranger?" "Because you just saved a man's life and didn't ask for anything in return." "That counts for something." She looked away. Her throat moved as she swallowed. "I appreciate the offer, but I can't." "Think about it." Gideon pulled a slip of paper from his pocket, a receipt from the feed store, and borrowed a pencil from Doc Miller. He scrawled his name and the ranch location. "You change your mind, that's where I'll be." He handed it to her. She took it slowly, her fingers brushing his for just a second. The contact was brief, incidental, but it sent a jolt through him, unexpected and unwelcome. He stepped back. Clara folded the paper and slipped it into her pocket without looking at it. "Thank you," she said quietly. Gideon nodded. Then he turned and walked back to his horse, ignoring the way his heart was beating too fast, the way his thoughts kept circling back to whiskey-colored eyes and steady hands, and a woman who faced blood and pain without flinching. Luke was going to have a field day with this. By the time the sun set, the injured passengers were stable and loaded into wagons heading for Miller's Crossing. Clara sat in the back of Doc Miller's wagon, her wounded arm finally bandaged, her face pale but composed. Gideon rode alongside, ostensibly to make sure the road stayed clear, but really because he couldn't seem to make himself leave. Doc Miller glanced at him. "You planning to follow us all the way to town?" "Just making sure there's no more trouble." "Uh-huh?" The old doctor's eyes twinkled. "That why you offered her a job?" Gideon didn't answer. Doc Miller chuckled. "Thought so." They reached Miller's Crossing as the last light bled from the sky. The town was small, one main street, a church, a general store, a saloon, and a boarding house run by a widow named Mrs. Callahan who charged too much and cooked too little. Doc Miller pulled up in front of the boarding house and helped Clara down from the wagon. She moved stiffly, favoring her injured arm. "You'll need rest," Doc Miller said, "and to keep that wound clean, change the dressing twice a day." Clara nodded. "Thank you, doctor." "Don't thank me. Thank him." He jerked his chin toward Gideon. "He's the one who pulled your trunk out of that wreck." Clara turned, looked at Gideon. "Thank you. Just doing what needed doing." "Still." She hesitated, then asked, "The job offer, was that real?" Gideon's chest tightened. "Real as it gets? I don't have references. I don't have much of anything, actually. My belongings were on that stage, and most of them are ruined." "Don't need references. Need someone who knows what they're doing. You proved that today." She studied him for a long moment. "Why are you being kind to me?" The question caught him off guard. "I'm not being kind. I'm being practical. Practical men don't offer jobs to strangers." "Maybe I'm not as practical as I thought." The words came out rougher than he intended. Gideon cleared his throat. "Look, you need work. I need help. That's all this is." But even as he said it, he knew it was a lie. Because when Clara Hale looked at him with those guarded, whiskey-colored eyes, something in his chest cracked open, Just a hairline fracture, barely noticeable, but there all the same. I'll think about it, Clara said finally. Fair enough. He tipped his hat and turned to go. But before he could mount his horse, Clara called out, Mr. Cross? He looked back. The lodging here. How much does it cost? Gideon's jaw tightened. He'd heard the stories about Mrs. Callahan gouging travelers. Too much. I don't have much money. He reached into his pocket and pulled out a fold of bills, peeled off enough to cover a week's stay and then some. He walked back and pressed it into her hand. Consider it a loan. Clara stared at the money. I can't. You can, and you will. His voice was firm. Pay me back when you're on your feet. Mr. Cross? Gideon. She blinked. What? Call me Gideon. Mr. Cross was my father. A faint smile touched her lips, the first real smile he'd seen from her. It was small, fleeting, but it changed her whole face, made her look younger, softer. All right, Gideon. The sound of his name in her voice did something strange to him, something he didn't have words for. He nodded once, then walked back to his horse and swung into the saddle. As he rode out of town, he felt her eyes on his back, felt the weight of that slip of paper in her pocket, felt the hairline crack in his chest widen just a little more. Luke was definitely going to have a field day with this. Or the Double C Ranch sat 5 miles outside Miller's Crossing, nestled in a valley where the grass grew thick in spring and the creek ran cold and clear year-round. The house was solid, built by Gideon's grandfather from timber and stone, designed to last generations. The barn was newer, the bunkhouse clean, the corrals well-maintained. Everything about the place spoke of care and permanence, everything except the silence. Gideon lived alone in the main house. Luke had his own cabin on the eastern edge of the property. The hired men, 3 of them, steady and competent, stayed in the bunkhouse and kept to themselves. There were no women, no laughter, no life beyond the rhythms of work and weather. When Gideon rode in that night, Luke was waiting on the porch, whittling a piece of wood and grinning like a fox in a henhouse. Heard about the stage wreck, Luke said. Also heard you played hero. Gideon dismounted. Doc Miller needed help. And the woman? What about her? The one you gave money to, the one you offered a job. Gideon froze. How the hell do you know that already? Luke's grin widened. Mrs. Callahan's niece works at the boarding house. Word travels fast. It's not what you think. I think you met a woman who didn't fall all over herself trying to charm you, and it scared you so bad you threw money at her and ran. Gideon's hands curled into fists. I didn't run. You didn't stay either. There was nothing to stay for, except maybe a conversation, maybe getting to know her, maybe nothing. Gideon's voice was hard. She needed help. I gave it. End of story. Luke stood, setting the wood aside. His expression sobered. You gave her the job offer because you want her here. Admit it. I don't want anything. You're lying to yourself, Gid, and you're good at it. But I know you. I know that look in your eyes. You haven't looked at anyone like that since Martha. Gideon's chest tightened. This is nothing like that. You're right. It's not. Luke stepped closer, his voice dropping. Because this woman, she's not here for your land or your money. She's here because she's got nowhere else to go, and that terrifies you even more. Gideon wanted to argue, wanted to shove his brother back and tell him to mind his own business. But Luke had a talent for seeing straight through him, for finding the truth Gideon buried under silence and stone. I offered her a job, Gideon said finally. That's all. And if she takes it, then she works here, same as anyone else. Luke searched his face. You gonna keep those walls up forever? As long as I need to. That's a lonely way to live. It's the only way I know. Luke sighed. Then, without warning, he reached into his pocket and pulled out the gold ring, their mother's ring. He held it up, and the lamplight from the house caught the metal, making it glow. You want this back yet? Gideon stared at it. The weight of memory pressed down on him. His mother's hand, her voice, her belief in love and legacy, and the kind of future he'd stopped believing in. No. You will, Luke said quietly. One day, You will." He slipped the ring back into his pocket and walked away, leaving Gideon alone on the porch with the night pressing in and the crack in his chest widening into something that felt dangerously close to hope. Clara Hale spent 3 days in Miller's Crossing, recovering from the wreck and deciding what to do next. She kept to herself, speaking only when necessary, eating meals in her room and avoiding the curious stares of the townspeople. Mrs. Callahan tried to pry, asked about her family, her plans, where she'd come from, but Clara deflected every question with the kind of polite vagueness that shut down conversation without causing offense. She had practice at this. Years of practice. At night, she lay awake in the narrow boarding house bed and stared at the ceiling, her mind churning. The stage wreck had destroyed most of her belongings. The few things she'd salvaged, a change of clothes, her medical supplies, a worn leather journal, fit into a single bag. She had $23 to her name, no family, no references, no safe place to go, and she had Damian Ashford hunting her. The thought made her stomach twist. She'd been running for 8 months, ever since she'd walked out of his Philadelphia mansion with nothing but the clothes on her back and her father's research notes. Damian was wealthy, connected, and utterly convinced that she belonged to him. Not as a wife. He'd never wanted that. As property. A thing he could control, display, use. Her father's work had made her valuable. Damian's obsession had made her a prisoner. Leaving had been the bravest thing she'd ever done, and the most dangerous. She'd changed her name, cut her hair, traveled west in stages, always moving, never staying long enough to be found. But Damian had resources. He had private detectives, legal connections, friends in every major city from New York to San Francisco. And he had patience. She knew he was still looking, knew he wouldn't stop until he dragged her back or destroyed her trying. The job offer from Gideon Cross was a lifeline she hadn't expected. A chance to disappear into the anonymity of ranch work, to have a roof over her head and enough distance from civilization that Damian's reach might not extend. But it was also a risk, because staying in one place meant being found, and being found meant losing everything. She pulled the slip of paper from her pocket and unfolded it. Gideon's handwriting was blunt, efficient, just his name and the ranch location. No flourishes, no wasted words. It reminded her of the man himself, hard, silent, guarded, but also kind, in his own way. He'd given her money without expecting anything in return, had offered her work without demanding her story, had looked at her like she was capable, not fragile. And when their hands had touched, just for that brief second, she'd felt something she hadn't felt in years. Safety. It was an illusion, she knew. Nowhere was truly safe, but the illusion was tempting, desperately tempting. On the 4th morning, she made her decision. She paid Mrs. Callahan, thanked Doc Miller for his care, and hired a wagon to take her to the Double C Ranch. The driver, a grizzled man who asked no questions, dropped her at the main gate and drove off, leaving her standing in the dust with her single bag and a heart beating too fast. The ranch was bigger than she'd expected, more permanent, the kind of place that had weathered storms and droughts and hard times without breaking. Clara walked up the long drive, her boots crunching on gravel, her eyes taking in every detail. The house, the barn, the corrals where horses stood in the shade, flicking their tails at flies. And on the porch, sitting in a rocking chair with a piece of wood in his hands, was a younger man who looked enough like Gideon to be family. He stood when he saw her. "You must be Clara Hale." "I am." "Luke Cross, Gideon's brother." He grinned, easy, open, the kind of smile that made people trust him. "He's out checking fence lines, but he'll be back soon. Come on up. I'll get you some water." Clara climbed the porch steps. Luke disappeared inside and returned with a tin cup filled with cold well water. She drank gratefully, the liquid soothing her dry throat. "So," Luke said, settling back into his chair, "you took the job. If it's still available." "Oh, it's available. Gid doesn't make offers he doesn't mean." He studied her with open curiosity. "You know anything about cattle?" "Enough. I've worked on farms, treated animals. I'm a fast learner." "Good. Because this place will keep you busy." He paused. "Can I ask you something?" Clara tensed. "Depends on the question." "Why'd you say yes?" She considered lying. considered giving him the same polite vagueness she'd given everyone else. But something about Luke's open, honest face made her want to tell the truth, or at least part of it. "Because I need work," she said, "and your brother gave me a chance when he didn't have to." "That's it?" "That's enough." Luke nodded slowly. "Fair. But just so you know, Gid's a good man. Better than he thinks he is. He's been hurt, and he's built walls to keep from getting hurt again. So if you're planning to take advantage, I'm not." "Good." Luke's grin returned. "Then welcome to the Double C." Before Clara could respond, the sound of hoofbeats echoed across the yard. She turned and saw Gideon riding in, his hat shadowing his face, his shoulders square and solid against the sky. He dismounted in one smooth motion, and when he looked up and saw her standing on his porch, he went completely still. For a long moment, neither of them spoke. Then Gideon walked forward, slow and deliberate, until he stood at the base of the porch steps. His gray eyes met hers, and she saw surprise there, relief, and something else, something he quickly buried. "You came," he said. "I did." "You took the job. If you'll still have me." His mouth twitched, not quite a smile, but close. "I will." Clara exhaled. The tension in her shoulders eased just a fraction. "Thank you." "Don't thank me yet. Work's hard, hours are long, and I don't tolerate laziness or carelessness." "I'm neither lazy nor careless. We'll see." But there was no malice in his voice, just the gruff practicality of a man who'd been let down too many times to trust easily. "Luke, show her to the spare room in the house. She'll stay there until we figure out something more permanent." Luke stood. "Come on, Miss Hale. I'll get you settled." Clara followed him inside, but as she crossed the threshold, she glanced back. Gideon stood in the yard, watching her with an expression she couldn't quite read, guarded, wary, but also, just maybe, hopeful. And for the first time in 8 months, Clara Hale allowed herself to believe that maybe, just maybe, she'd found a place where she could stop running, at least for a little while. The spare room was small but clean, with a window overlooking the eastern pastures and a bed that didn't sag in the middle. Clara set her bag on the wooden chair and stood for a moment, letting the silence settle around her. It felt strange to be still. For 8 months, she'd lived in constant motion, trains, stages, rented rooms she never stayed in long enough to memorize. This room, with its plain walls and the scent of pine soap, felt almost dangerously permanent. Luke lingered in the doorway. "Bathroom's down the hall. We eat breakfast at dawn, dinner at noon, supper after the work's done. Gid's not much for conversation at meals, but he won't bite if you talk to him." "Good to know." "And Clara?" Luke's voice softened. "Whatever you're running from, you don't have to tell us, but you should know Gid's got a talent for protecting what's his. This ranch, the people on it. You work here. That includes you." Clara's throat tightened. "I'm not running from anything." Luke just smiled, sad and knowing. "Sure you're not." He left her alone. Clara sank onto the bed and pressed her hands to her face, breathing slowly until the tremor in her fingers stopped. She'd gotten good at lying. Had to be. But Luke Cross saw too much, just like his brother. It made her nervous, made her wonder how long she could keep her secrets buried before someone started digging. She unpacked her few belongings, changed into work clothes, trousers she'd borrowed from a farm wife in Kansas, a man's shirt she'd bought 2 sizes too big, and braided her hair tight. When she looked in the small mirror above the dresser, she barely recognized herself. The woman staring back was lean, hard-edged, with shadows under her eyes, and a mouth that had forgotten how to smile easily. Nothing like the Clara Hale who'd once worn silk dresses and attended Philadelphia society dinners on Damian Ashford's arm. That woman was gone. Had to be. She left the room and made her way downstairs. The house was quiet, solidly built, with wide plank floors and furniture that looked handmade. Functional, not fancy. A stone fireplace dominated the main room, and above it hung a faded photograph of a man and woman standing in front of the ranch house. Gideon's parents, she guessed. The man had Gideon's jaw, the woman Luke's smile. She found Gideon in the kitchen, pouring coffee from a dented pot. He looked up when she entered, his expression unreadable. "You settle in all right?" "Yes, thank you." He nodded and poured a second cup without asking, sliding it across the table toward her. Clara wrapped her hands around the warm tin, grateful for something to hold. The coffee was strong, bitter, the kind that woke you up and kept you moving. "We start early here," Gideon said. "Sun's up, we're working. Sun's down, we stop. Sundays are lighter, just feeding, basic care. You'll work with me and Luke for the first week, learn the rhythms. After that, you'll handle the veterinary needs on your own." "Understood." "You ever deliver a calf?" "Twice. One breech, one premature." Gideon's eyebrows rose slightly. "Both survive?" "All three did." Something shifted in his expression. Respect, maybe, or surprise. "Good. We've got a heifer due any day. I'll want you there when she goes into labor." "I can do that." They drank their coffee in silence. Clara studied him over the rim of her cup, taking in the lines around his eyes, the set of his shoulders, the way he held himself like a man braced for disappointment. She recognized it because she felt the same way. Like trust was a luxury neither of them could afford. "Can I ask you something?" she said finally. Gideon's eyes flicked to hers. "Depends. Why did you really offer me this job?" He was quiet for a long moment. Then he set his cup down and leaned back in his chair, his gaze steady. "Because I watched you save a man's life without hesitation. Because you didn't ask for credit or payment or anything except to make sure everyone else was stable first. And because when I offered you money, you looked like you wanted to refuse but were too practical to be proud." He paused. "Reminded me of someone." "Who?" "Me." Clara's chest tightened. She didn't know what to say to that, so she said nothing. Just held his gaze and let the silence stretch between them, heavy with things neither of them were ready to speak aloud. Luke banged through the front door, shattering the moment. "Gid, we've got a problem. One of the mares cut her leg on the fence wire. Deep gash, bleeding pretty good." Gideon was on his feet instantly. Clara followed, grabbing her medical kit from upstairs and meeting them at the barn. The mare was a chestnut with a white blaze, her eyes rolling in pain as blood streamed from a jagged wound on her foreleg. Clara moved quickly, her hands steady as she assessed the damage. "Hold her head," she told Luke. To Gideon, "I need clean water, rags, and something to brace her leg." They worked without speaking, a strange synchronicity forming as Clara cleaned the wound, stitched the torn muscle, and wrapped the leg tight. The mare calmed under her touch, her breathing evening out. When Clara finally stepped back, sweat dotted her forehead, and her shirt was streaked with blood, but the mare was stable. Gideon stared at her. "You just saved me a $300 loss. I did my job." "You did more than that." He reached out, hesitated, then lightly touched her shoulder. The contact was brief, but it burned through the fabric of her shirt. "Thank you." Clara nodded, not trusting her voice. Because the way Gideon looked at her in that moment, like she mattered, like she was capable, like she was worth something beyond her usefulness, made the walls she'd built around herself tremble. And that was more dangerous than any wound. ESM. The first week passed in a blur of work and exhaustion. Clara learned the ranch's routines, the quirks of each animal, the rhythm of life that started before dawn and ended long after dark. She treated a cow with hoof rot, vaccinated the spring calves, set a dog's broken leg. Gideon watched her work with quiet intensity, saying little but missing nothing. Luke talked enough for both of them, filling the silence with stories and jokes and questions Clara deflected with practiced ease. She learned things about the Cross brothers, too. Learned that Gideon woke before everyone else and walked the fence lines alone, checking for damage, thinking thoughts he never shared. Learned that Luke played harmonica on the porch after supper, old songs their mother had loved. Learned that the hired men, Tom, Jesse, and Carlos, respected Gideon absolutely, feared his temper not at all, and watched Clara with cautious curiosity. She also learned that Gideon Cross was a man who carried his loneliness like a second skin, so familiar he didn't even notice the weight anymore. On the 8th day, the pregnant heifer went into labor. Clara was checking the horses when Jesse found her, his face tight with worry. "Miss Hale, we need you in the birthing pen. Now." She ran. Found Gideon already there, his sleeves rolled up, his expression grim. The heifer lay on her side, straining, her sides heaving. But nothing was happening. No calf. No progress. "How long has she been like this?" Clara asked, dropping to her knees beside the animal. 2 hours. Gideon's voice was rough. Something's wrong. Clara ran her hands over the heifer's swollen belly, feeling for position. Her heart sank. The calf's breech. Hind legs first. If we don't turn it, we'll lose them both. Can you turn it? I can try. She scrubbed her hands and arms, then carefully reached inside, searching for the calf's position. The heifer bellowed, thrashing weakly. Gideon moved to her head, murmuring low reassurances, his hands gentle despite their size. Clara worked by feel, her fingers finding tiny hooves, a tail, the curve of a hip. She pushed, guided, coaxed, sweat running down her spine as she fought to rotate the calf into proper position. Almost, she whispered, just a little more. The calf shifted, turned. Suddenly the front hooves appeared, followed by a wet nose. Clara pulled gently, steadily, and the calf slid free in a rush of fluid and blood. It lay still for one terrible moment, then coughed, shook its head, and drew its first shuddering breath. Clara sat back, gasping. Her arms shook. Her whole body shook. But the calf was alive. The heifer turned her head, lowing softly, already licking her newborn clean. You did it, Gideon said, his voice rough with something that might have been awe. Clara looked at him. His face was streaked with dirt and sweat, his eyes bright. And when he smiled, really smiled, the first genuine smile she'd seen from him, it transformed his entire face, made him look younger, less guarded, almost happy. We did it, she corrected. He helped her to her feet. They stood there, covered in blood and birth and the evidence of hard-won life, and Clara felt something shift between them. Some invisible boundary crossed. She saw it in the way Gideon looked at her, the way his hand lingered on her arm just a second too long before he pulled away. You should clean up, he said gruffly. Supper's in an hour. So should you. His mouth twitched. Yeah, I should. But neither of them moved. Just stood there in the fading light, two people who'd forgotten how to let anyone close, realizing they might not have a choice anymore. That night, Clara couldn't sleep. She lay in bed listening to the sounds of the ranch, the distant lowing of cattle, the creak of wood settling, the whisper of wind through the eaves. Her mind raced, circling back to Gideon's smile, his touch, the way he'd looked at her like she was more than just hired help. It was dangerous, all of it, because letting herself care meant lowering her guard. And lowering her guard meant Damien could find her. She rose, pulled on her robe, and padded downstairs for water. Found Gideon sitting at the kitchen table in lamplight, a ledger open in front of him and a whiskey glass at his elbow. He looked up. Can't sleep? No, you? Never could after a hard birthing. Too much adrenaline. He gestured to the chair across from him. Sit, if you want. Clara sat. The lamplight cast shadows across his face, softening the hard edges. He poured a second glass of whiskey and slid it toward her. She took it, sipped, felt the burn all the way down. Can I ask you something? Gideon said. Her stomach clenched. Maybe. What are you really doing out here? Clara's hand tightened on the glass. I told you I needed work. That's not all of it. His voice was quiet, not accusatory, just certain. You flinch when strangers get too close. You never talk about where you came from, and sometimes, when you think no one's watching, you look scared. Clara's pulse hammered. I'm not asking you to trust me, Gideon interrupted. I know what that costs, but if there's trouble following you, I need to know, because this ranch, these people, I protect what's mine. I'm not yours. You work here. That makes you mine to protect. Something in Clara's chest cracked. She set the glass down carefully, her hands trembling. There's someone from back east. He thinks he has a claim on me. He's wrong, but he's powerful and he doesn't let go of things easily. Gideon's expression darkened. He hurt you? Not physically. Not much anyway. But he controlled everything. Where I went, who I saw, what I did. My father worked for him, and when my father died, Damien decided I was part of the inheritance. Damien Ashford, shipping magnate, Philadelphia society, friends in every courthouse from Boston to San Francisco. Clara's voice was flat, emotionless. She'd learned not to feel when she talked about this. Feeling made it real. I left 8 months ago, He's been looking for me ever since." Gideon was silent for a long moment. Then he said, "He comes here. He'll regret it." "You don't understand. He has lawyers, detectives, money. I don't care." Gideon leaned forward, his eyes fierce. "No one takes anyone off my land without my say-so, and I don't give a damn how much money he has." Clara stared at him. "Why would you do that? You barely know me." "Because you saved my heifer. Because you work harder than any man I've hired. And because nobody deserves to be hunted like an animal." His voice softened. "You're safe here, Clara. Long as you want to be." Tears pricked Clara's eyes. She blinked them back furiously. "You can't promise that. Watch me." She wanted to believe him, wanted it so badly it hurt, but she'd learned the hard way that promises were just words, and words couldn't stop men like Damian Ashford. Still, when Gideon reached across the table and covered her hand with his, rough, warm, solid, she didn't pull away. Just let herself feel the weight of another person's protection, even if only for a moment. "Thank you," she whispered. Gideon nodded, pulled his hand back, but something had changed between them. Some fragile thread of trust spun in the lamplight and the shared confession of their separate fears. Clara went back to bed eventually, but she carried the feeling of his hand on hers all the way up the stairs and into her dreams. 3 weeks passed. Clara settled into the rhythm of ranch life, her hands growing calloused, her skin tanned, her body strong from constant work. She and Gideon developed a wordless partnership, anticipating each other's needs, moving in sync during difficult procedures, communicating more in glances than in sentences. Luke watched them with knowing amusement, but kept his thoughts to himself. Then, on a bright Tuesday afternoon, a stranger rode onto the ranch. Clara was in the barn treating a gelding's abscess when she heard hoofbeats. She looked up to see a man in an expensive suit dismounting from a fine black horse. He was tall, clean-shaven, with calculating eyes and a smile that never reached them. Her blood turned to ice. She knew that smile, had seen it across dinner tables, in carriages, in the hallway outside her locked bedroom door. Not Damien, but one of his men. The stranger's gaze swept the yard and landed on her. His smile widened. "Miss Hale, what a pleasure to find you in such rustic surroundings." Clara's hand tightened on the gelding's halter. "You're not welcome here." "Mr. Ashford would disagree. He's been very worried about you, I'm sure. He's asked me to extend an invitation. Come back to Philadelphia. All is forgiven." "I have nothing to be forgiven for." The man's smile turned cold. "Mr. Ashford has legal claim to your father's research you took when you left. That makes you a thief, Miss Hale. Unless you return voluntarily, he'll be forced to involve the authorities." "The research was my father's. It belongs to me." "The courts will decide that. But I assure you Mr. Ashford's lawyers are very persuasive." He pulled an envelope from his coat. "A summons. You're required to appear in Denver in 2 weeks to answer charges of theft and fraud." Clara's vision swam. "That's a lie." "Is it?" The man's eyes glittered. "You have 2 weeks, Miss Hale. Cooperate, and Mr. Ashford might be merciful. Refuse, and he'll make sure you spend the next 10 years in prison." He dropped the envelope on a hay bale and turned to leave. But before he could mount his horse, Gideon stepped out of the barn's shadow, his rifle held loose but ready. "You delivered your message," Gideon said, his voice flat and cold. "Now get off my land." The stranger's smile faltered. "This doesn't concern you. Everything that happens on this ranch concerns me. And the lady said you're not welcome." "The lady is a fugitive and a thief." "The lady is my employee, and you're trespassing." Gideon took a step forward. "Leave, now, or I'll remove you myself." The two men stared at each other. Clara held her breath, her heart hammering. Finally, the stranger mounted his horse, his expression darkening. "You're making a mistake, Mr. Cross. Damian Ashford doesn't forget enemies." "Good," Gideon said. "Neither do I." The stranger rode off, dust rising behind his horse. Gideon lowered the rifle and turned to Clara. She was shaking, her face bloodless. "You all right?" he asked quietly. "He'll come back. Damian won't stop." He'll use the law. He'll use money. He'll use whatever it takes. Then we'll fight him. Gideon's voice was iron. You're not going anywhere. You don't understand what he's capable of. I understand he's a bully who thinks money makes him untouchable. Gideon set the rifle aside and gripped her shoulders gently. Clara, look at me. She did. His eyes were fierce, certain, unafraid. We'll get you a lawyer. We'll fight the summons. And if he comes here in person, he'll learn real quick that Colorado law doesn't give a damn about Philadelphia money. Clara wanted to believe him, but Damien's reach was long and his patience infinite. Still, standing in Gideon's grip, seeing the absolute conviction in his face, she felt something she hadn't felt in months. Hope. Small, fragile, but real. Okay, she whispered. Gideon nodded, released her shoulders but didn't step away. We'll handle this. Together. And for the first time since she'd fled Philadelphia, Clara Hale let herself believe that maybe she didn't have to run anymore. Maybe she'd finally found somewhere worth standing and fighting for. That evening, Gideon rode into Miller's Crossing and returned with a lawyer named Thomas Winters, a lean man with sharp eyes and a reputation for despising bullies. He sat at the kitchen table, the summons spread before him, his expression growing darker with each page he turned. This is legally worthless, Winters said finally. The charges are vague, the jurisdiction questionable. Ashford's lawyers are fishing, hoping you'll panic and run, or surrender voluntarily. So we ignore it? Clara asked. No, we answer it. File a counter-motion, challenge jurisdiction, demand proof of ownership for this alleged research. Winters tapped the papers. But we do it smart. Force them to show their hand before we show ours. How long will that take? Gideon's voice was tight. Weeks, maybe months. Courts move slow, and distance works in our favor. By the time this gets before a judge, we'll have built a case so solid, Ashford's lawyers will advise him to drop it. Clara's hands twisted in her lap. And if they don't? Winters met her eyes. Then we go to trial. And we win. The certainty in his voice should have been comforting, but Clara had watched Damien destroy lives with nothing but a signature and a well-placed bribe. She'd seen him twist the law into a weapon, wielding it with surgical precision against anyone who defied him. After Winters left, Clara stood on the porch, staring at the darkening sky. Gideon joined her, 2 cups of coffee in his hands. He gave her one without speaking. They stood in silence, the night settling around them like a heavy blanket. You think he'll really drop it? Clara asked quietly. No. She looked at him, startled by his honesty. Gideon's jaw was set, his eyes on the horizon. Men like Ashford don't drop things. They escalate, push until something breaks. He paused. But that doesn't mean we roll over. I don't want you caught in this. Any of you. Too late. He turned to face her, his expression hard. The second his man rode onto my land and threatened you, he made it my fight too. Gideon, I mean it, Clara. You're not alone in this anymore. And I don't abandon my people. The word my echoed in her chest. My people. As if she belonged here. As if she were something worth protecting, not just convenient labor or a problem to be managed. Clara's throat tightened and she had to look away before the tears could fall. Thank you, she whispered. Gideon didn't answer, just stood beside her, solid and immovable, while the stars came out one by one and the ranch settled into the quiet rhythms of night. The next 3 weeks passed in brittle tension. Clara worked harder than ever, throwing herself into the demands of the ranch as if physical exhaustion could drown out the fear gnawing at her insides. Gideon watched her with growing concern, but he didn't push, just made sure she ate, made sure she rested, made sure she wasn't alone when the nightmares came. Because they did come. Every night Clara woke gasping, Damien's voice echoing in her ears, his hands on her wrists, his cold certainty that she would never escape. And every night she lay in the darkness, reminding herself that she was 1,000 miles away, that Gideon Cross stood between her and the past, that maybe, just maybe, she was safe. Luke noticed too. He started staying closer to the house, finding excuses to check on her, filling the silence with stories about the ranch, their parents, the time Gideon punched a man for mistreating a horse. He made her laugh despite herself, and Clara began to understand why Gideon loved his brother so fiercely. Then, on a gray morning heavy with the threat of rain, a rider came. Not Damien's man this time. Someone worse. The sheriff. Clara was mending a fence when she saw him, a heavy-set man in his 50s, wearing a badge and a carefully neutral expression. Gideon met him at the gate, and Clara's stomach dropped when she saw the paper in the sheriff's hand. She walked over slowly, her heart hammering. "Sheriff Barnes," Gideon said, his voice flat. "What brings you out here?" "Official business, I'm afraid." Barnes looked uncomfortable. "Got a warrant here, for Clara Hale, issued out of Denver, signed by Judge Morrison." Clara's vision swam. "On what charges?" "Theft of proprietary documents, fraud, unlawful flight to avoid prosecution." Barnes's voice was apologetic. "I'm sorry, Miss Hale. I gotta take you in." "That warrant's garbage," Gideon said, his voice hard as stone. "The charges are fabricated. We've got a lawyer." "I'm sure you do, but I still got to enforce it." Barnes shifted his weight. "I don't like this any more than you do, Gideon, but it's legal and I got no choice." "There's always a choice." "Not one that keeps me wearing this badge." Gideon's hand moved toward his rifle. Clara caught his wrist, her fingers tight. "Don't." He looked at her, his eyes wild. "I'm not letting him take you." "You have to." Her voice was steady, even though everything inside her was screaming. "If you fight this, he'll arrest you too. And then who'll run the ranch? Who'll help Luke?" "Clara, I'll go." She released his wrist and turned to Barnes. "But I want a doctor to examine me first. Document any injuries." Barnes frowned. "You hurt?" "I was, before I came here. Ashford's handiwork." She met his eyes. "I want it on record, just in case." The sheriff's expression darkened, but he nodded. "Fair enough. We'll stop at Doc Miller's on the way to town." Clara went inside to gather her things. Her hands shook as she packed, but she forced herself to move methodically. A change of clothes, her father's journal, the few dollars she had left. When she came back downstairs, Gideon was waiting, his face like carved granite. "This isn't over," he said. "I know. I'll get Winters. We'll fight this. You won't spend a single night in jail." "Gideon, I swear it, Clara." He stepped closer, his voice dropping. "I will burn everything I own before I let him take you back to Philadelphia." The intensity in his eyes stole her breath. She wanted to tell him not to make promises he couldn't keep, wanted to warn him that Damien always won, always found a way to twist the law until it served his purposes. But the words died in her throat because Gideon Cross looked at her like she was worth fighting for, like she mattered more than land or money or safety. And she realized with a sharp, painful clarity that she'd fallen in love with him. Somewhere between the stagecoach wreck and the birthing pen, between the late-night confessions and the silent partnership, she'd led him past every defense she'd built. And now, standing in his kitchen with a sheriff waiting outside and a warrant for her arrest, she understood what that meant. It meant she had something to lose. Again. "Be careful," she said quietly. Gideon's hand came up, his fingers brushing her cheek. The touch was gentle, hesitant, as if he were afraid she'd break. "You too." Then Clara walked out into the gray morning and climbed into the sheriff's wagon, leaving behind the only place that had felt like home in 8 long months. Doc Miller examined her in his office, his mouth pressed into a thin line as he cataloged the old bruises, the half-healed burns on her wrists, the faint scars that told a story of prolonged captivity. He wrote it all down in careful, clinical detail, then sealed the report and handed it to Sheriff Barnes. "This goes on file," Doc Miller said, his voice hard. "And if anything happens to this girl while she's in custody, I'll hold you personally responsible." Barnes nodded grimly. "Understood." They took Clara to the small jailhouse in Miller's Crossing. It was clean, at least, with a narrow cot and a barred window that let in the fading afternoon light. Barnes locked the door with obvious reluctance. "I'll make sure you get fed," he said. "And I'll send word to your lawyer." "Thank you." He left her alone. Clara sat on the cot and stared at the bars, her mind racing. This was exactly what Damien wanted, her isolated, vulnerable, cut off from the people who might protect her. He'd used the legal system to keep her here while he maneuvered behind the scenes, pulling strings, greasing palms, ensuring that by the time she saw a courtroom, The verdict was already decided. She had to think, had to find a way out that didn't involve dragging Gideon into deeper trouble. But exhaustion weighed on her like chains, and eventually she lay down and closed her eyes, praying that sleep would come without nightmares. It didn't. She woke hours later to the sound of raised voices, then gunfire. Clara bolted upright, her heart hammering. Through the barred window she could see orange light flickering, smell smoke, hear shouts and the thunder of hoofbeats. The door to the jail burst open. Luke Cross stood there, his face grim, a ring of keys in his hand. "Come on," he said. "We're getting you out of here." "Luke, what?" "No time. Gideon's outside. Someone set fire to the livery as a distraction. We got maybe 5 minutes before Barnes realizes what's happening." Clara's mind reeled. "You're breaking me out? You got a better plan?" She didn't. She grabbed her bag and followed Luke out of the cell, through the office, into the chaotic night. The livery was burning, flames licking at the sky while townspeople ran with buckets and blankets. In the confusion, no one noticed two figures slipping into the shadows. Gideon waited with 3 horses. His face was set, his eyes blazing. "Mount up!" Clara swung into the saddle. They rode hard, leaving Miller's Crossing behind, the smell of smoke chasing them into the darkness. Clara's thoughts spun wildly. They'd just made her a fugitive for real. Assaulting a lawman, jailbreak, fleeing custody. Damien would use this, would twist it into proof of her guilt. But when she looked at Gideon riding beside her, his jaw set with absolute determination, she couldn't bring herself to regret it. They rode for hours, pushing the horses until they were lathered and blowing. Finally, Gideon pulled up in a sheltered canyon, a place where rock walls blocked the wind and a small stream provided water. They dismounted in silence, breathing hard, the adrenaline starting to fade. Luke built a small fire while Gideon tended the horses. Clara stood apart, her arms wrapped around herself, trying to process what had just happened. "You shouldn't have done that," she said finally. Gideon looked up from checking his horse's hooves. "Had to. Now you're criminals too. Barnes will come after you. Damien will." "Damien set you up." Gideon straightened, his voice hard. "I talked to Winters before we came for you. The warrant? Signed by a judge who's been on Ashford's payroll for years. The charges? Based on testimony from people who don't exist. It was a trap, Clara, to get you isolated so Ashford's men could grab you without witnesses." Clara's blood ran cold. "How do you know?" "Because while you were in that cell, 2 strangers checked into the boarding house. Well-dressed, Eastern accents, and they were asking questions about the jail's security." Luke poked at the fire, his expression dark. "Gideon figured if we didn't move fast, you'd disappear, and we'd never see you again." Clara's knees went weak. She sank onto a rock, her hands shaking. "He was going to take me tonight." "Yeah." Gideon crouched in front of her, his eyes fierce. "But he didn't, and he won't, because I'm done playing by his rules." "What are we going to do?" "We're going back to the ranch. We're fortifying, and we're waiting for him to make his move." Gideon's voice was iron. "Because Ashford wants you? He's going to have to come through me first." Clara looked at him. This hard, silent man who'd offered her shelter when she had nothing, who'd protected her without asking for anything in return, who'd just thrown away his own safety to keep her free. And she realized that Damien Ashford had made a fatal miscalculation. He'd assumed she was alone, assumed no one would fight for her. He was wrong. They reached the Double C just before dawn. The ranch looked the same, solid, permanent, unchanged, but everything felt different now. Clara dismounted on shaking legs and walked into the house, exhaustion crashing over her in waves. Gideon caught her elbow. "You should rest." "I can't." Her voice was hoarse. "Not until I know what's coming." "Then we plan." He guided her to the kitchen table, where Luke was already spreading out maps and making notes. "Barnes will send word to Denver. Within 2 days, maybe 3, there will be federal marshals involved. We need to be ready." "Ready for what?" Clara asked. "You can't fight the law." "Can't fight corrupt law," Luke corrected. "But honest law? That's different." Gideon nodded. "Winters is filing motions, challenging jurisdiction, demanding evidence. He's also contacting newspapers, getting your story out before Ashford can control the narrative. And we're documenting everything. Witnesses, timelines, Doc Miller's report. Building a case so airtight that even a bot judge can't ignore it. Clara's throat tightened. And if that doesn't work? Gideon's eyes met hers, steady and certain. Then we disappear. All of us. Head to Montana, change our names, start over. I can't ask you to do that. You're not asking. I'm offering. He leaned forward, his voice softening. Clara, I've spent 15 years building walls, keeping everyone at arm's length, telling myself it was safer to be alone. And then you showed up, and those walls started cracking. I fought it, tried to convince myself it didn't mean anything, but it does. He paused, his jaw working. You matter. To me. To Luke. To this ranch. And I'll be damned if I let some Philadelphia bastard take you away. Clara's vision blurred. Gideon, I love you. The words fell into the silence like stones into still water. Clara stared at him, her heart hammering. Luke quietly stood and left the kitchen, giving them privacy. You don't have to say it back, Gideon continued, his voice rough. I know this is fast. I know you've got no reason to trust anyone, least of all me. But I needed you to know, before whatever's coming hits, I needed you to know that you're not alone. That you've got someone who'll stand with you, no matter what. Claire couldn't speak, couldn't breathe. All she could do was reach across the table and take his hand, threading her fingers through his, holding on like he was the only solid thing in a world gone mad. I love you too, she whispered finally. And I'm terrified of what that means. Me too. A ghost of a smile touched his mouth. But I figure we'll figure it out as we go. She laughed, the sound half sob. That's a terrible plan. It's the only one I've got. They sat there, hands clasped, the morning light creeping through the windows and the weight of the coming storm pressing down on them both. But for that one moment, Clara let herself believe that love might be enough, that trust might hold when everything else fell apart, that maybe, just maybe, she'd finally found someone worth fighting for. 2 days later, Damien Ashford arrived. He came in a black carriage pulled by matched horses, flanked by 6 men with hard eyes and guns on their hips. They rolled up to the ranch in the bright afternoon sun, and when Damien stepped out, tall, elegant, his silver hair gleaming, Clara felt 15 years old again, small and powerless and utterly trapped. Gideon stood on the porch, his rifle in his hands, Luke beside him. The hired men spread out across the yard, their weapons ready. Clara stayed inside, watching through the window, her hands clenched into fists. Mr. Cross, Damien called, his voice smooth and cultured. I believe you have something that belongs to me. Nothing on this ranch belongs to you, Gideon replied, his voice flat. I'm afraid the law disagrees. Miss Hale is wanted for theft and fraud. I've come to escort her back to face justice. The law also says a man can protect his property, and she's on my land, which makes her my business. Damien's smile was cold. I admire your chivalry, but interfering with a lawful arrest is a federal offense. Step aside, and I'll forget this unfortunate incident. And if I don't, then my men will remove you, by force if necessary. Damien's eyes glittered. I have a federal warrant, Mr. Cross, signed by a judge with jurisdiction over this entire territory. You have no legal ground to stand on. Gideon didn't move, didn't lower the rifle. Show me the warrant. Damien gestured to one of his men, who approached with a folded document. Gideon read it slowly, his expression darkening. Then he looked up. This warrant's based on false testimony. The witnesses listed don't exist. Prove it. I intend to. In court. With lawyers and evidence and everything your money can't buy. Damien's smile faded. You're making a mistake, Mr. Cross. I have resources you can't imagine. I can destroy you, this ranch, everyone you care about. And I will, unless you give me what I want. Then you'd better get started. Gideon's voice was ice, because Clara Hale isn't going anywhere. For a long moment, the 2 men stared at each other, Damien calculating, Gideon immovable. Then Damien's expression shifted, became something darker, more dangerous. Very well, he said softly. You've chosen your side. Remember that. when everything you've built turns to ash. He climbed back into the carriage. His men mounted their horses, and as they rode away, Clara felt a chill run down her spine, because Damien Ashford never made empty threats, and the real war was just beginning. The dust from Damien's carriage had barely settled when Gideon turned to Luke, his face carved from stone. "Get the men together. I want armed patrols on the property line, rotating shifts. No one comes onto this land without us knowing about it." Luke nodded and took off at a run. Gideon climbed the porch steps and found Clara standing in the doorway, her face pale, but her eyes fierce. "He's not going to stop," she said. "I know. He'll come back with more men, more warrants. He'll find a way to make this legal." "Let him try." Gideon set the rifle against the wall and gripped her shoulders. "Clara, look at me. We knew this was coming. We're ready." "Are we?" Her voice cracked. "Gideon, you saw him. That wasn't just anger. That was a promise. He's going to destroy everything you've built, and it's my fault. Stop." His hands tightened, not painful, but firm. "This isn't your fault. You didn't ask for any of this. You ran because you had to, and you ended up here because you needed help. That's all. The rest? That's on Ashford. And I'll be damned if I let him win." Clara searched his face, looking for doubt, for hesitation. Found nothing but absolute certainty. She sagged against him, her forehead pressing against his chest, and felt his arms come around her, solid and warm and unbreakable. "I'm scared," she whispered. "Me too." His voice rumbled through his chest. "But we're scared together. That counts for something." It did. It counted for everything. The next 48 hours passed in a blur of preparation. Tom, Jesse, and Carlos took turns patrolling the fence lines, rifles at the ready. Luke rode to neighboring ranches, quietly spreading word that the Double C might need help. And Gideon worked with Thomas Winters, who arrived with a stack of legal documents and a grim expression. "Ashford's playing this smart," Winters said, spreading papers across the kitchen table. "He's filed complaints with the territorial governor, claiming you're harboring a fugitive and interfering with federal law. He's also petitioned for an emergency hearing in Denver, requesting immediate extradition." "Can he do that?" Clara asked. "Technically, yes. But we're fighting it on multiple fronts. I've filed counter-motions challenging jurisdiction, demanding he produce actual evidence of theft, and requesting a change of venue based on judicial corruption." Winters tapped one document. "I've also contacted the Denver Post. They're interested in running a story about Eastern money trying to manipulate Western courts. Public pressure might slow him down." Gideon leaned back in his chair. "And if it doesn't? Then we go to trial. And we make damn sure the whole territory knows what kind of man Damien Ashford really is." Clara's stomach twisted. A trial meant exposure, scrutiny, her entire history laid bare for strangers to judge. But it also meant a chance to fight back, to force Damien into the light where his charm and money couldn't hide the truth of what he'd done. "How long do we have?" she asked. "Week, maybe 2. Ashford's pushing hard, but the courts don't move at his pace out here. They'll want to see evidence, hear arguments." Winters met her eyes. "In the meantime, you need to stay put. Don't give him any excuse to claim you're fleeing justice." Clara nodded. Staying put meant trusting that Gideon could protect her, that the law would work in her favor, that Damien's reach had limits. It meant having faith in something beyond her own ability to run and hide. It terrified her, but she stayed. On the third night, the attack came. Clara was asleep when the first gunshot cracked through the darkness. She bolted upright, her heart hammering, and heard Gideon's voice shouting orders downstairs. She grabbed her father's journal, shoved it into her shirt, and ran. The yard was chaos. Flames licked at the barn's roof where someone had thrown a torch. Armed men fired from the tree line, their muzzle flashes bright in the darkness. The hired hands returned fire, while Luke worked frantically to free the panicked horses from the burning barn. Gideon stood on the porch, his rifle barking steadily, his face grim. Clara dropped beside him, her hands shaking. "How many?" she gasped. "At least a dozen. Professionals." He fired again, and a figure in the trees dropped. "Ashford's done playing nice. What do we do?" "We hold them off until help arrives." He glanced at her, his eyes fierce. Luke sent word to the neighboring ranches. They'll come. And if they don't come in time? Gideon didn't answer, just reloaded and kept firing. Clara looked around desperately. The barn was fully engulfed now. The horses screaming as Luke led them to safety one by one. Tom was down, clutching his shoulder, blood seeping between his fingers. Jesse and Carlos were pinned behind the water trough, outnumbered and outgunned. They were losing. Clara's mind raced. Damien had sent these men to either capture her or drive her out, and he didn't care who died in the process. She thought about the warrant, the legal maneuvering, the cold certainty in his eyes when he'd promised to destroy Gideon, and she realized with sudden, terrible clarity what she had to do. "I'm going out there," she said. Gideon's head whipped around. "Like hell you are. If I surrender, he'll call off the attack. Your ranch will be safe. Your men—" "No." His voice was iron. "You go out there, he'll take you, and we'll never see you again." "Better than watching you die for me." "Clara!" Another volley of gunfire cut him off. The water trough splintered, and Carlos cried out, falling back. Jesse dragged him behind cover, but Clara could see the blood spreading across Carlos's leg. She made her decision. Before Gideon could stop her, she stood and walked down the porch steps, her hands raised. "Stop shooting!" she shouted. "I'm coming out!" "Clara, get back here!" Gideon roared. She ignored him, walked into the open yard, her heart hammering so hard she thought it might burst. The gunfire stuttered, then stopped. A figure emerged from the trees. Not Damien, but one of his men, the same cold-eyed stranger who delivered the summons weeks ago. "Smart girl," the man said. "Come quietly, and your friends live." Clara took another step forward. Behind her, she heard Gideon's boots hitting the porch, heard Luke shouting. But before anyone could reach her, the stranger grabbed her arm and yanked her toward the trees. Then all hell broke loose. Gideon's rifle cracked, and the man jerked backward, his grip loosening. Clara twisted free and ran, not toward the house, but toward the tree line, drawing the gunmen away from the people she loved. Bullets kicked up dirt at her heels. She heard Gideon screaming her name, heard the thunder of hoofbeats as Luke charged after her. She broke through the trees and found herself face to face with Damien Ashford. He stood beside his carriage, impeccably dressed despite the violence, his expression one of mild disappointment. "Clara, must you always be so dramatic?" "Call off your men," she gasped. "Give me what I want, and I will." "I don't have anything you want. The research died with my father." Damien's smile was cold. "We both know that's a lie. But even if it weren't, you're mine, Clara. You always have been. I invested years in you, protected you, gave you everything." His voice hardened. "And you repaid me by running like a thief in the night. You kept me prisoner. I kept you safe. You kept me broken." His hand shot out and caught her wrist, his fingers digging in hard enough to bruise. "You think this rancher will protect you? He's a fool playing at chivalry. I'll destroy him, Clara. I'll burn his ranch to ash, scatter his cattle, and ruin him so thoroughly he'll wish he'd never heard your name." "Then do it." Clara's voice was steady despite the fear coursing through her. "But you won't get me. I'd rather die than go back to you." Damien's eyes narrowed. "That can be arranged." A gunshot split the air. Damien stumbled backward, his hand releasing Clara's wrist. She spun and saw Luke, 20 yards away, his rifle smoking. But before she could run, one of Damien's men tackled Luke from behind. They went down hard, struggling. Clara heard Gideon's roar of fury, saw him charging through the trees like an avenging angel. But Damien recovered quickly, pulling a pistol from his coat. He aimed at Gideon, and Clara didn't think, just threw herself forward, slamming into Damien's arm as he fired. The bullet went wide. Damien cursed and backhanded her across the face. She fell, tasting blood, her vision swimming. Through the haze, she saw Gideon reach them, saw him drive his fist into Damien's jaw with enough force to snap the older man's head back. They grappled. Two men fighting with the kind of savage intensity born from absolute conviction. Damien fighting to own, Gideon fighting to protect. But Damien's men were closing in, and Luke was still down, pinned by two attackers. Clara struggled to her feet, grabbed a fallen branch, and swung it with all her strength into the nearest man's skull. He dropped like a stone. She grabbed his rifle, turned, and fired at the man holding Luke. Missed. Fired again. This time the man jerked and fell away. Luke rolled to his feet, his face bloodied, and together they moved toward Gideon. But Damien had produced a knife, and Gideon had a gash across his ribs, blood soaking his shirt. They circled each other, breathing hard, both wounded but neither willing to yield. "You can't win this," Damien snarled. "I have the law. I have money. I have everything." "You don't have her," Gideon's voice was hoarse. "And you never will." Damien lunged. Gideon sidestepped and drove the knife from his hand, then brought his elbow down on Damien's spine. The older man collapsed, gasping. But before Gideon could finish it, one of Damien's men fired from the shadows. The bullet caught Luke in the shoulder, spinning him around. "No!" Clara screamed. Luke hit the ground hard, blood spreading fast. Gideon turned toward his brother, and in that instant of distraction, Damien pulled a derringer from his boot. Clara saw it, saw him aim at Gideon's back, and moved without thinking. She tackled Damien just as he fired, and felt the searing pain of the bullet tearing through her side. She fell, the world tilting sideways. Heard Gideon's roar of anguish, felt hands on her, lifting her, carrying her. The sound of gunfire faded, replaced by the thunder of hoofbeats and shouting voices. Help had arrived. The neighboring ranchers, armed and furious. Clara's vision blurred. She tried to speak, to tell Gideon she was all right, but the words wouldn't come. The last thing she saw before darkness claimed her was his face above hers, streaked with blood and dirt and tears, his mouth forming her name like a prayer. She woke in her room at the ranch, sunlight streaming through the window and pain radiating from her side. Doc Miller sat in a chair beside the bed, his expression relieved. "Welcome back," he said quietly. Clara's throat was dry. "Luke?" "Alive. Bullet went clean through his shoulder. He'll be fine." "Gideon?" "Stubborn as ever. He's been sitting outside your door for 3 days, refusing to leave." Doc Miller stood and opened the door. "You can come in now." Gideon entered slowly, as if afraid she might vanish. His face was haggard, his eyes red-rimmed, his hand shaking slightly as he approached the bed. He sank into the chair Doc Miller had vacated and took her hand, his grip gentle despite the tremor. "You scared me," he said, his voice raw. "I'm sorry." "Don't apologize. Just don't do it again." He pressed his forehead to her knuckles. "When I saw you go down, I thought—" His voice broke. "I thought I'd lost you." "You didn't." Clara squeezed his hand. "What happened after I—" "The neighbors arrived, drove off Ashford's men. We captured 3 of them, including Ashford himself." Gideon's eyes were hard. "He's in custody now. Barnes has him locked up tight, and this time there's no bought judge to set him free. The men we caught are talking, giving testimony about the bribes, the false warrants, the orders to attack." He paused. "Winters says the case against him is solid. Ashford's going to prison." Clara's chest tightened. "It's really over?" "Not yet, but soon." Gideon lifted his head, his eyes meeting hers. "You saved my life, Clara. Took that bullet meant for me." "You would have done the same." In a heartbeat. His hand came up to cup her cheek, his thumb brushing away the tear that had escaped without her permission. "I love you, and I'm not letting you out of my sight ever again." Clara laughed, the sound half sob. "That might get inconvenient." "I don't care." She pulled him closer, ignoring the pain in her side, and kissed him. It was gentle, tentative, full of all the things they couldn't say aloud, relief and terror and gratitude and love so fierce it ached. When they finally pulled apart, Gideon rested his forehead against hers, his breath warm on her lips. "Marry me," he whispered. Clara's heart stopped. "What?" "Marry me. I know it's fast, I know we've got a mess to clean up, but I don't want to wait. I don't want to wonder or second guess or waste another day pretending I can live without you." His voice was hoarse, urgent. "Say yes, Clara, please." She should say no. Should tell him it was too soon, that they needed time to heal, to rebuild. But when she looked into his eyes and saw nothing but absolute certainty, she knew there was only one answer she could give. Yes. Gideon's face transformed, the hard lines softening into something that looked almost like joy. He kissed her again, deeper this time, a promise sealed with touch and breath, and the kind of love that survived bullets and fire and the worst a man like Damien Ashford could throw at them. When he finally pulled away, Clara saw Luke standing in the doorway, his arm in a sling, a grin splitting his battered face. "About damn time," Luke said. "I was starting to think you'd never ask." Gideon threw a pillow at him. Luke caught it one-handed, laughing. And for the first time in longer than Clara could remember, she felt something that had been missing for years. Hope. Real, solid, unshakable hope. 2 weeks later, Thomas Winters arrived with news and a woman Clara had never seen before. She was tall, elegantly dressed, with sharp eyes and an air of quiet authority. Winters introduced her as Evelyn Price, a lawyer from Denver with a reputation for taking down corrupt officials. They gathered in the kitchen, Clara still moving carefully because of her healing wound, Gideon hovering protectively, Luke pouring coffee with his good arm. Price spread documents across the table, her expression satisfied. Damien Ashford has been formally charged with bribery, conspiracy, assault, and attempted murder, she said. The evidence is overwhelming. Between the testimony from his captured men, Doc Miller's reports on Clara's injuries, and the witnesses to the attack on this ranch, he's looking at 20 years minimum. Clara's hands trembled around her coffee cup. And the charges against me? Dismissed. All of them. The judge who signed the original warrant has been removed from the bench pending investigation. Your father's research has been deemed your legal property, and Ashford's claims to it have been nullified. Price smiled. You're a free woman, Miss Hale. The relief was so intense, Clara thought she might faint. Gideon's hand found hers under the table, squeezing tight. There's more, Price continued. During the investigation, we uncovered something interesting. Ashford's fortune wasn't entirely self-made. A significant portion came from a trust established by his late wife's family. A family that included distant relatives who were never notified of certain irregularities in how Ashford managed those funds. Clara frowned. What kind of irregularities? The kind that suggests fraud on a massive scale. And here's where it gets interesting. Price pulled out another document. Your father, Clara, was distantly related to Ashford's late wife through his mother's side, which means you have a legitimate claim to a portion of that trust. Clara stared. I don't understand. You're an heir. Not the primary heir, but a legitimate one. And given Ashford's crimes and the evidence of fraud, the court is likely to award you a substantial settlement. Price's eyes glinted. We're talking about enough money to ensure you never have to worry about security again. Clara's mind reeled. After years of running, of having nothing, of being powerless, suddenly she had everything: money, freedom, safety, justice. It felt unreal. I don't want his money, she said quietly. Price raised an eyebrow. It's not his, not legally. It belongs to the trust, and you're entitled to your share. Then I want it used for something good. Clara's voice strengthened. Set up a fund for women escaping dangerous situations, for medical care, legal help, safe housing. Use Damien's stolen fortune to help the people he would have destroyed. Price studied her for a long moment, then smiled. I can do that. In fact, I think it's an excellent idea. Gideon's hand tightened on Clara's. She looked at him and saw pride shining in his eyes, bright and fierce and absolutely certain. You're something else, he murmured. I learned from the best. That evening, after Price and Winters had left and Luke had retreated to his cabin, Clara and Gideon sat on the porch watching the sun set over the Colorado hills. The ranch was quiet, the damage from the attack slowly being repaired, the cattle grazing peacefully in the pastures. You really don't want the money? Gideon asked. I want a life that's mine, built on something real, not on Damien's crimes. Clara leaned against his shoulder. Besides, I have everything I need right here. Gideon turned and pulled a small object from his pocket. The lamplight from the house caught it, making it glow. His mother's ring. I got this back from Luke, he said quietly. Told him I was ready. He held it up, the simple gold band catching the last rays of sunlight. It's not fancy, not like what you probably had before, but it's real, and it's been waiting for the right person for a long time. Clara's vision blurred. Gideon, I know we already said yes, but I wanted to do this proper. He slid off the chair and knelt on the porch boards, the ring balanced on his palm. Clara Hale, Will you marry me? Will you build a life here with me, on this ranch, with all its scars and imperfections? Will you take a chance on a man who spent 15 years convinced he'd be alone forever? Clara couldn't speak through the tears. She just nodded, held out her hand, and watched as Gideon slipped the ring onto her finger. It fit perfectly, as if it had been made for her all along. He stood and pulled her into his arms, holding her like she was something precious and breakable and infinitely worth protecting. And Clara buried her face in his chest and let herself cry. For everything she'd lost, for everything she'd survived, and for everything she'd finally impossibly found. "I love you," she whispered against his shirt. "I love you too." His voice was rough with emotion. "And I'm going to spend the rest of my life proving it." They stood there as the stars came out, two people who'd been broken and battered and left for dead by life's cruelty, holding each other and believing, for the first time in years, that maybe the world could still be kind, that maybe love was worth the risk, that maybe, just maybe, they'd found their way home. The wedding took place 6 weeks later, on a crisp October morning when the aspens had turned gold and the air smelled of wood smoke and coming winter. They married in the front yard of the Double C Ranch, with Doc Miller officiating and half of Miller's Crossing in attendance. Clara wore a simple cream-colored dress that Mrs. Callahan had sewn with surprising tenderness, and Gideon stood beside her in his best shirt, his eyes never leaving her face. Luke served as best man, his arms still in a sling but his grin wide enough to split his face. When Gideon slipped the ring onto Clara's finger for the second time, this time with words and witnesses and the weight of forever behind it, his hand trembled slightly, and Clara saw the sheen of tears in his eyes that he blinked away quickly. "I do," she said, her voice clear and certain. "I do," Gideon echoed, and the words felt like a vow stronger than any legal document, any warrant, any threat Damian Ashford could have wielded. When Doc Miller pronounced them husband and wife, Gideon cupped Clara's face in his calloused hands and kissed her with a gentleness that made her heart ache. The crowd cheered, Luke whistled, and for one perfect moment, the world narrowed to just the two of them, two broken people who'd found each other in the wreckage and decided to build something new. The celebration lasted until sunset. There was food and music, stories and laughter, the kind of joy that comes from surviving something terrible and choosing to live anyway. Clara danced with Gideon under the stars, his arms around her waist, and felt the last pieces of her old life, the fear, the running, the constant looking over her shoulder, finally fall away. "Happy?" Gideon murmured against her ear. "More than I ever thought possible." He pulled back to look at her, his expression soft in the firelight. "I'm going to spend every day making sure you stay that way." "That's a big promise." "I'm a man who keeps his promises." She knew he was, had learned it in the way he'd stood between her and danger, the way he'd fought for her when she'd had nothing to offer in return, the way he looked at her like she was worth everything he had to give. They stayed on the porch long after the guests had left, wrapped in blankets in each other, watching the embers of the bonfire die down and talking about the future. About expanding the ranch, building a real veterinary practice, maybe starting a family when the time was right. Simple dreams, the kind that felt impossible just months ago. "I got a letter from Evelyn Price yesterday," Clara said quietly. "The trust settlement came through. It's more than I expected." Gideon's arm tightened around her shoulders. "How much more?" "Enough to fund the Women's Aid Foundation for decades. Enough to build a hospital in Miller's Crossing. Enough to—" She paused, then turned to face him. "Enough to do real good in the world." "You're going to change lives, Clara Cross." The sound of her new name sent warmth flooding through her chest. "We're going to change lives, together." He kissed her temple and they sat in comfortable silence until the cold drove them inside to the bedroom they now shared, to the bed where they made slow, tender love and fell asleep tangled in each other's arms, safe and whole and home. Winter came hard that year, blanketing the ranch in snow and forcing everyone indoors for weeks at a time. Clara used the time to organize the foundation, working with Evelyn Price to establish legal frameworks, identify communities in need, and create systems that would help women escape situations like the one she'd fled. It was exhausting, demanding work, but it gave her purpose beyond survival. It transformed her pain into something useful. Gideon watched her with quiet pride, never questioning the hours she spent on correspondence, never begrudging the money she poured into the cause. He understood, in the way only someone who'd built something from nothing could, that this was how Clara healed, by ensuring no one else would have to run the way she had. In February, word came that Damien Ashford had been convicted on all charges. 25 years in federal prison with no possibility of parole. The news arrived via telegram, and Clara read it 3 times before the reality sank in. He couldn't hurt her anymore. Couldn't hunt her. Couldn't control her. She was free. Truly, completely free. That night she cried in Gideon's arms, not from fear or grief, but from the overwhelming relief of finally being able to breathe without the weight of Damien's shadow pressing down on her. Gideon held her through it all, his presence solid and unwavering, and when the tears finally stopped, he dried her face with his sleeve and made her laugh with a terrible joke Luke had told him at breakfast. "You know what this means?" he said, smoothing her hair back from her forehead. "What?" "You get to just live now. No more running, no more looking over your shoulder. Just life." The simplicity of it made her throat tight. "I don't know if I remember how." "Then we'll figure it out together." He pressed a kiss to her forehead. One day at a time. And they did. Spring brought new life to the Double C. The cattle dropped healthy calves, the horses foaled, and Clara's veterinary practice grew as word spread about the woman who could save animals no one else could. Ranchers came from 3 counties away, seeking her help with difficult births, mysterious illnesses, injuries that would have meant putting an animal down. She saved more than she lost, and the ones she couldn't save she mourned properly, the way her father had taught her. Gideon worked beside her when he could, learning from her the way she'd learned from him about cattle and land and the rhythms of ranch life. They made a good team, balancing each other's strengths, covering each other's weaknesses. And slowly, the ranch stopped feeling like just Gideon's place and started feeling like theirs. Luke moved into town that summer, taking a job as deputy sheriff under Barnes and courting the schoolteacher with an enthusiasm that made Clara laugh and Gideon shake his head in fond exasperation. But he visited often, bringing news and gossip and the kind of easy affection that made the ranch house feel full even when it was just the 3 of them around the dinner table. In August, Clara received a letter from a young woman in Kansas, one of the first recipients of aid from the foundation. The woman wrote about escaping her husband's violence, finding shelter and legal help, starting over in a new town with her 2 children. She wrote about hope, about second chances, about the kindness of strangers who believed her story when no one else would. Clara showed the letter to Gideon that evening on the porch, her hands shaking slightly. "This is what it was all for," she said quietly. "Every mile I ran, every night I was terrified. It led to this. To being able to help someone else run toward safety instead of just away from danger." Gideon pulled her close, his chin resting on top of her head. "Your father would be proud of you." "I hope so." She folded the letter carefully. "I wish he could have met you. I think he would have liked you." "Yeah?" "He always said the measure of a man wasn't what he owned, but what he was willing to sacrifice for others." She tilted her head back to look at him. "You've given up so much for me, Gideon. Your peace, your safety, your certainty. I haven't given up anything." His voice was firm. "I've gained everything that matters. You. A purpose. A reason to stop hiding behind walls." He cupped her face gently. "You didn't take from me, Clara. You gave me my life back." She kissed him then, deep and slow, pouring into it all the gratitude and love and fierce devotion she felt, but could never quite put into words. When they finally pulled apart, both breathing hard, Gideon rested his forehead against hers and smiled. "Come on," he said. "I want to show you something." He led her to the barn where he'd been spending his evenings for the past month, working on a project he'd refused to let her see. He opened the door with a flourish, and Clara gasped. Inside was a fully equipped veterinary office. Clean tables, surgical tools, medicine cabinets, everything she could possibly need to treat animals properly instead of making do with improvised setups. Gideon had built it all himself, every shelf and cabinet, had ordered supplies from Denver and beyond, had created a space that was entirely hers. "I know you've been working out of the tack room," he said, suddenly uncertain. "But I thought, if you're going to build a real practice, you need a real space. And I wanted you to have it here, on our land, so you never have to wonder if you belong." Clara couldn't speak, could barely breathe. She walked slowly through the space, trailing her fingers over the smooth wood, the gleaming instruments, the carefully organized supplies. Every detail spoke of Gideon's attention, his care, his absolute belief in her abilities. "It's perfect," she finally managed. "Gideon, you built this for me?" "Built it for us, for the life we're making." He came up behind her, wrapped his arms around her waist. "You've got a gift, Clara, and I'll be damned if I let it go to waste because you don't have the right tools." She turned in his arms and pulled him down for a kiss that started tender and quickly became something more urgent, more desperate, more real. They made love there in the new office, on the clean floor Gideon had sanded smooth, surrounded by the evidence of his faith in her and her future. Afterward, lying in his arms with their clothes scattered and her heart full to bursting, Clara whispered, "I'm pregnant." Gideon went absolutely still. "What?" "I'm pregnant. About 3 months, I think. I wasn't sure, but Doc Miller confirmed it last week." She looked up at him, suddenly nervous. "I know we didn't plan. I mean, we talked about it eventually, but—" "Clara." Gideon's voice was hoarse. He sat up, pulling her with him, his hands framing her face with a gentleness that made her eyes burn. "Are you sure?" "Yes." "We're having a baby?" "We're having a baby." The smile that broke across his face was like sunrise after the longest night. "We're having a baby," he repeated, as if testing the words, tasting them. Then he laughed, bright and joyous and utterly transformed. "We're having a baby!" He kissed her breathless, then pulled her to her feet and spun her around despite her laughing protests. When he finally set her down, his eyes were wet and his grin was incandescent. "I'm going to be a father," he said wonderingly. "You're going to be a wonderful father," Clara corrected. "I don't know anything about babies." "Neither do I." We'll learn together." He pulled her close again, his hand splaying protectively over her still flat stomach. "I love you," he said fiercely. "You and this baby and the life we're building. I love all of it so much it scares me." "I know." Clara covered his hand with hers. "I love you too, both of you." They stood there in the veterinary office Gideon had built, surrounded by the tools of healing and hope, and let themselves dream about the future, about a child who would grow up knowing love and safety, who would learn about courage and kindness, who would never have to run because their parents had fought to build a world where running wasn't necessary. The baby came in March, a girl with Gideon's gray eyes and Clara's dark hair and a cry that could wake the dead. They named her Sarah, after Gideon's mother, and she was perfect in the way only desperately wanted children can be. Gideon held her for the first time with hands that shook, his face a mixture of terror and wonder. "She's so small," he whispered. "She's perfect," Clara said from the bed, exhausted and radiant. "She is." He looked up, his eyes shining. "You're perfect, both of you." Luke arrived an hour later with half the town in tow, bringing food and blankets and so much noise that Sarah woke screaming. But when Luke held his niece, his expression went soft in a way Clara had never seen. And she knew Sarah would have an army of people who loved her, who would protect her, who would make sure she never felt alone. Dr. Miller examined both Clara and the baby, pronounced them healthy, and left with stern instructions about rest that Clara promptly ignored. There was too much to do, too much life happening, to waste time lying in bed. Gideon, however, had other ideas. He hovered, fussed, refused to let her do anything more strenuous than hold the baby. It drove her crazy and made her love him even more. "I survived being shot," she pointed out after he'd carried her to the rocking chair for the 3rd time that day. "I think I can walk 10 feet on my own. Humor me. You're being ridiculous. I'm being careful." He knelt beside the chair, his hand gentle on her knee. "I nearly lost you once, Clara. I'm not taking any chances now." Her irritation melted. She reached out and ran her fingers through his hair, marveling again at how this hard, closed-off man had opened himself so completely to her and their daughter. "I'm not going anywhere." "Promise?" "Promise." He kissed her palm, then stood and went to check on Sarah, who was sleeping in the cradle he'd carved himself during the long winter nights. Clara watched him adjust the blanket, his movements careful and unsure, and felt her heart expand with so much love she thought it might crack her ribs. This was what Damien had tried to steal from her, not just her freedom or her father's research, but this, the chance to love and be loved, to build a family, to wake up each morning knowing she was exactly where she belonged. He'd failed, and in failing, he'd given her something even more precious, the absolute certainty that the life she'd built with Gideon was real, was earned, was unshakably hers. 5 years later, Clara stood in the yard of the Double C Ranch and watched her daughter chase chickens with Luke's twin sons, their laughter bright in the summer air. The ranch had grown. More land, more cattle, a proper bunkhouse, and a renovated barn. The veterinary practice thrived, and Clara had trained 2 apprentices who helped manage the steady stream of animals needing care. The foundation had expanded beyond her wildest dreams. There were shelters in 6 states now, legal aid offices, job training programs. Evelyn Price ran the operations from Denver, but Clara stayed involved, writing letters, reviewing cases, sending money where it was needed most. Every woman they helped felt like a piece of her own story redeemed. Gideon emerged from the house, older now, but no less solid, his gray eyes finding hers across the yard with the ease of long familiarity. He crossed to her, slipped an arm around her waist, and pressed a kiss to her temple. "You thinking about him?" he asked quietly. Clara knew he meant Damien. She shook her head. "Not really, just thinking about how different my life could have been." "Regrets?" "Not a single one." She leaned into him. "Every terrible thing that happened led me here, to you, to Sarah, to this life. I wouldn't change any of it." "Even the bullet wound?" She laughed. "Even the bullet wound." They watched Sarah tackle one of the twins and dissolve into giggles. Luke emerged from the barn, saw the chaos, and waded in to separate the children with exaggerated authority. His wife, Emma, the schoolteacher, appeared on the porch and rang the dinner bell, and suddenly the yard was full of people, hired hands and neighbors and friends who'd become family. This was what home looked like, Clara thought. Not just a place, but a collection of people who chose each other, who showed up when things got hard, who celebrated the good days and endured the bad ones side by side. Gideon's hand found hers, his fingers threading through hers with practiced ease. "I got a letter from the territorial governor yesterday," he said. "They're considering new legislation about domestic violence, protections for women, consequences for abusers. Price thinks our foundation's work helped push it forward." Clara's throat tightened. "Real change." "Real change," Gideon agreed, "because you refused to stay silent, refused to let what happened to you be the end of your story." "We refused," Clara corrected. "I couldn't have done any of this alone." "Maybe not, but you started it. You were brave enough to run, to fight, to believe you deserved better." His voice dropped. "You taught me that too, that it's never too late to choose differently, to let people in, to trust that love might actually be worth the risk." Clara turned to face him fully. This man who'd stood between her and destruction, who'd fought for her when she had nothing to offer in return, who'd built her a life where she could finally breathe. "Best risk I ever took." "Same here." He kissed her, slow and sweet, while their daughter's laughter rang across the yard and the sun painted the Colorado sky in shades of gold. When they pulled apart, Sarah came running, demanding to be picked up, and Gideon swung her into his arms with the ease of practice. "Tell Mama what we built today," he prompted. "A tree house." Sarah's eyes shone. "Papa says it's for me and the twins, but I think he wanted an excuse to climb trees." Clara laughed. "I think you're right." "Come see." Sarah grabbed Clara's hand and pulled, impatient and joyful and utterly certain that her parents would follow wherever she led. And they did. Followed her to the massive oak behind the barn, where Gideon had constructed an elaborate treehouse, complete with rope ladder and carved railings. Followed her up into the branches where you could see the whole ranch spread out below, the house, the corrals, the pastures rolling away toward the mountains. "Look how far you can see," Sarah exclaimed. Clara looked, saw the land she and Gideon had built together, the life they'd carved from hardship and hope, saw the foundation's newest shelter going up in town, funded by Damien's seized fortune and Clara's determination, saw neighbors working their own ranches, women running businesses, children growing up free from the kind of fear that had once defined her existence. Saw the future, stretching out bright and unwritten. "Pretty far," she agreed softly. Gideon came up behind her, his arms encircling both her and Sarah. "Far enough?" Clara leaned back against his chest, her daughter's small hand in hers, and felt the last ghost of Damien Ashford finally release its grip on her heart. She'd run 1,000 miles to escape him, had fought through courts and bullets in her own terror, had nearly died defending the people she loved, and she'd won. Not just survival, but the kind of victory that transformed everything, turned trauma into purpose, fear into courage, isolation into belonging. "Far enough," she said. "More than far enough." As the sun set over the Double C Ranch, painting the sky in shades of amber and rose, Clara Cross stood in a treehouse with her husband and daughter and let herself believe, truly, deeply believe, that the worst was behind her and the best was yet to come. That love, the real kind, the kind worth fighting for, was always worth the risk. And that sometimes, the bravest thing you could do was stop running and build a life exactly where you stood, with the people who saw you clearly and chose you anyway. The evening star appeared bright against the darkening sky. Sarah pointed at it, demanding to know its name, and Gideon began teaching her about constellations while Clara watched them both with a heart so full it felt like it might overflow. This was her story now. Not the one Damien had tried to write, not the one fear had dictated, but the one she'd chosen, messy and beautiful and absolutely, perfectly hers. And as the stars came out one by one above the Colorado ranch that had become her home, Clara smiled and let herself rest in the simple, extraordinary truth that she was finally, completely, irrevocably free.